Okay, let's talk about borders. Let's talk about what's going on in Queensland, because I know you obviously represent, as the Liberal Party, many constituents here in Queensland, many of whom are small businesses that are hurting at the moment, many of whom are tourism operators who are hurting at the moment. It seems the Premier is absolutely determined to keep the borders of this state in Queensland closed until September.
Yeah, look, Gleeson, you might have to forgive me. I'm going to lose my lawyerly composure over this one, because when I have spent much of this week down on the Gold Coast talking with small businesses who have flow-on enterprises that depend on having tourists in town, when I see people whose businesses are in tourism, they are suffering. And if they don't get the interstate tourists coming to the Gold Coast in particular, but also to the sunny coast, also to Cairns, also to the rest of the coast, if they don't get that through the door this winter, that's 40% of their book for the year done and dusted. This is a rule that was never recommended by the National Cabinet. It was never recommended by the National Chief Medical Officer. It is not necessary. Now, it makes my blood boil when I see the Premier closing the borders, pointing the finger or shifting the responsibility for that decision onto the Queensland Chief Medical Officer. Her job is to give medically conservative advice, right? So she can give as medically conservative advice as she likes. She might say we should all never be allowed to leave our house again because there's germs in the world. But the Premier's job is to exercise judgment. The Premier's job is to balance that with economic and social and other considerations and to lead. But this woman couldn't lead a dog if it was at the end of a leash. I am so upset when I see the savings and the livelihoods of Queenslanders going down the drain just because this woman wanted to seem like she was tougher on this than everybody else. Let's get real. There are real Queenslanders suffering as a consequence of this rule, and it isn't making a jot of difference to Queenslanders' health. Open the borders and let us get back to work.
There she is, a fired-up Amanda Stoker. Before you go, Amanda, just quickly, $60 billion. That's the saving, if you want to approach it like that we've got as a result of that accounting error last week by Treasury. But the LNP has copped a lot of flack over this. I mean, you know, I think Albanese said you could have seen this from outer space. But at the end of the day, I mean, it is $60 billion that effectively is not going to be spent, which means that it's going to help the bottom line. I actually think it's a terrific concession to come out of what has obviously been an incredibly challenging and difficult time for this country.
Look, it is a difficult time, and in circumstances where so many Australians are worried about how much is having to be borrowed to facilitate many of the programs that are helping Australians get through this difficult time, the idea that we're going to borrow $60 billion less is something we should be relieved about. It's something that, as a parent, makes me go, well, thank heavens for that. That's a little bit less I've got to worry about my children bearing from this period. So it's good news that we have found that we won't be a further $60 billion in debt. But to see other groups in our community, and many of them, you know, wrote to me in the last few days, everyone wants to spend it on this, that or the other. The reality is it isn't money we have in a tin, you know, in the back of our cars at this point in time. It's something we would have had to borrow. So in circumstances where it's being borrowed, I think the Australian taxpayer should take a small exhale of relief at that news, although it is, you know, still to be noted that there is still a lot of money being borrowed, and that is going to require prudence now and in the medium and long term.
Amanda Stoker, great to see you tonight. Thanks for joining me.